I was the founder, together with two other gentlemen, of Euronext in the beginning of 2000. So I was CEO of the Dutch exchange that came into Euronext. And I was the CEO of Robeco, the Dutch asset management firm in the Netherlands, also for 5 years. So I've been working in the financial sector for a very long period of time. But when I joined this financial sector, I also joined at that time in London. I think one thing was very clear to me, and that was the fact that I did not understand the business at all, and I want to learn about the business, I want to understand it, so I start to read a rule book. But reading a rule book is the same as reading your textbook, tax, T-A-X book, for tax. I think it's very incomprehensible, it gives only instructions, and it doesn't give answer on the question why. And I felt I need to have an answer on the question why, because I want to know why people behaved as they did, and why certain things were not allowed and whether others were allowed. And to my knowledge, certain things who were allowed, I would say, were not correct. And certain things who were not allowed, I thought, well, what's the point here? So I personally had already early on a problem with rules and with my own moral compass, and I always had that fight for the rest of my life. What have we done wrong as individuals that made us come into this crisis? Was it stupidity? Were we incompetent? Were we too big risk takers? Or was it an issue of morality? And I come to the conclusion that 80% of the cases, I think there was a moral problem behind the crisis. And just that moral problem is the one which, I'm an economist, was never addressed while I had to learn on the university, while I was being educated. Because at the time when Adam Smith invented economy, it was still called a moral science. But in the course of last century, we have become, let's say, with a very unfriendly word, we have become plumbers. We simply have learned mathematical tricks, models, and the whole idea about the decision whether an act is right or wrong, that whole idea about that discussion, that has been taken out of the economical science and moved to philosophy and ethics. But we as economists have not learned to answer that question. If you are a doctor and you treat a patient and the patient is ill, you probably go twice a day to the patient. And once you see the patient smiling in his bed, again, you know he's on recover. So in essence, a doctor and a patient have a close relationship and they look each other in the eye. The baker the same. The baker, which bread is not good enough, he will see that not many people will return in his shop. So I think in a lot of the society is a direct link between the producer and the consumer. But in the financial sector, and that's I think one of the issues we have to deal with, you make a product in the United States of America, you cut it in 20 pieces, you rewrap it, and you sell it to the German Landesbank or to a bank in Japan or whatever. And you at the end of the day, of course, you earn a bonus. So the end result of your action, you will never see. So the moral correction mechanism, which is there if you are a patient in a bed and you treat a patient incorrectly, you are corrected morally continuously. That doesn't exist. It exists, but it's much weaker in the financial sector. If you make bread, you can feel it, you can taste it. If you make a CDO, collateral debt obligation, still a lot of people in the financial sector doesn't know what it is. You cannot touch it, you cannot feel it. It doesn't smell, although it has to smell as a rat, but it doesn't smell. But therefore the market is much more abstract, and that means therefore that you cannot see that a product is wrong because you cannot see it. The market is much more leveraged, which means that small people deal with big numbers. So if, for example, somebody here in this room quotes LIBOR with the Barclays Bank in London, and I am the customer, I would ask you to increase your quote by 1 basis point. 1 basis point is enough. I offer you a nice lunch, so you're my friend. And why not? Because 1 basis point is absolutely nothing. So in the end of the day, I think that is, you do me a favor, you increase your quote with 1 basis point. But the quote is calculated over $1 trillion. So in that particular moment, you take away millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars from one part of the world to the other part of the world. So the value movement of this very small amount is enormous because the leverage is so big. But morally, we are not capable. We cannot morally leverage ourselves. We cannot just readjust our morals for the fact that we operate with very high leverage products. So therefore, it doesn't seem to somebody much. You don't seem to steal much, but in essence, the amounts are huge. Well, how do we solve it? I think we have solved in the past by every time if there's a crisis to create new rules. And we always forget to clean up the old rules. So we have rules and rules and rules. And I'm in favor of taking the rules out and going back to principles. And at least make sure that the rules and principles are in line with each other and balanced. Because if you have too many rules, as one of my statements, you become a rule addict, you become a moral robot, you go on your automatic pilot because you cannot follow the rules and at the same time follow your own conscience. I asked a question to the Dutch bankers, are you willing to finance a company who is active in deforestation in Borneo? So if they cut all the trees, blah, 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 all the Dutch bankers say, of course not, of course not. Then I asked the same question to the Chinese, and Chinese says, yes, 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 no problem. Then I asked the next question to the Dutch bankers, are you willing to finance the Chinese bankers? Of course. So you see that, let's say, also in finance, where you have common, let's say, morals, it's sometimes very difficult to obey them, especially also if it is to be done in an indirect way. Can we cure ourselves from the disease called crisis? Can we make sure that we will never be a crisis again? The answer is no. There will be a next crisis, do not worry. Every 5 or 6 years there will be one. So if we're not careful and we have not solved this one, we get a new one. The issue, of course, is that we need to solve the fact that the crises are so big and so deep that they threaten our existence. So I think what we need to resolve is the next time the crisis is shallower, less deep, and less devastating as the one before. We will still have crises, but they should be less. And that means that we have to address, and I come back to the beginning of my presentation, we have to address human behavior, because again, that's at the root cause of crisis. We have to address morality, the way we behave. We have to make sure that we are less moral robots. How do you do that? It is actually bringing back your own judgment, your own conscience back into your own decision-making process. And that has to start with education, education, education. So it has to start at lower school. It has to start at high school. It has to be basically central to the university. It has to be brought back in economics as a science. And also, I think during your career in the financial sector, people have to be trained in making moral decisions and not becoming robots as we have become now. What we are now discussing in the Netherlands is the bankierseed, so the oath. So if you have to take an oath, then suddenly that tells you that you cannot hide behind rules anymore, because an oath is an oath. So suddenly if you have misbehavior, which is officially not forbidden by the rules, then you can still hang on the highest tree. So I think an oath in itself is already a signal that you have an own conscience and that you should use it. So that's, I think, already one important instrument. In the end of the day, if one bank is sustainable, the other one is not, then consumers should make that difference. So consumers should make their own choice. That's issue is, of course, is always, well, we have the Dutch problem with chickens in the supermarkets, plofkippen. You want a chicken to have a very good life, but once you're in a supermarket, you buy the cheapest one. So you can only, you as a consumer, have a responsibility as well. You have to make sure that you open an account with a bank who behaves better than the other one. And if the consumer power is not behind that concept, it's very difficult to change the organization as well. So my point I just made on the finance side, you have to, in your investor, you have to invest in companies who are duurzaam. If you're a consumer, you have to do the same. If that's what you do, the world will change.
We live in democracies that are deeply addicted to the idea of economic growth. And basically, every political party lives off the idea of a promise of economic growth. So the question here is, I think, and the crisis reveals that, because the structural growth, especially in the Western world, and more specifically in Europe, is not weak due to the economic crisis, but was already weak for a much longer period. And so the question here is, with populations that are aging, with a demographic deficit announcing itself already now, how do we see the future of economic growth in our societies in Europe? I think it's quite evident that the problems we witness now have a cultural or moral dimension. If we look at the relations between North and South, it's for me quite evident that problems of a culture of taxation in Greece are deeply linked to the historical experience in Greece and its relations between citizens and the state. All, even very superficial views of Europe reveal that there is quite a difference in terms of trust between the northwestern part of Europe, where relations of trust between citizens and the state are relatively high, and the low trust in southern Europe. Now, our expectation in creating the Eurozone is, of course, that those cultural differences will somehow diminish, that there will be a convergence between North and South in cultural terms, because in the end, we have become so dependent upon each other that the budget deficit in Greece has become our deficit, that those who want to enter Spain illegally are the citizens of the Netherlands or Germany of the near future, that Berlusconi is our politician as well. Can you imagine a democracy that is functioning at such a large and vast scale as 500 million people in Europe? And what are the responsibilities of elites functioning in this environment? I think our elites have become too detached, but in a different sense. Not because things have become too abstract or too interdependent, but because they have lost the sense of responsibility for specific circumstances, for maintaining institutions like the university with all the normative questions that implies, in governing banks in a way that is responsible. So, all the appeals to morality in the end fade away if we are not able to ask the question on what scale is a democracy really living? And then we should look at democracies, not only from a normative point of view, but look at the empirical side of things. Just to end here, I just saw an article in the French newspaper Le Monde, which indicated that more than 70% of French people live in the region where they were born. So, apart from all the normative questions, we completely misunderstand the world we live in if we think everybody has become mobile, everybody has become part of a culture of world citizenship. In the end, vast majorities of citizens, also in Europe, are still very local in their aspirations, very local in their patterns with whom they marry, very local in their sense of obligation, very local in the language in which they can disagree with others. And if we disregard those fundamental social realities, we indeed become very detached, and I see the signs around me everywhere.